Welcome to The Details with Elliott, Connie, and Adam Frower. This is a podcast where we examine the intersection between solution-focused brief therapy and current topics going on in the world. And we do this because we genuinely want the world to be a better place. So enjoy and come examine the details with us. So there's a big, major trial that's about to start, maybe even by the time this recording is released publicly will have started, that's tying a bow on 2020 and the events of 2020. The trial is about charges to a man named Kyle Rittenhouse. I think that's how you say his name. And basically what happened is he lived in one state, traveled to another with an assault rifle because he thought it was his duty to protect people during the protests in 2020 that were related to the George Floyd murder. And according to some accounts, he was standing in front of a car dealership and he started screaming like it's his duty to protect his car dealership. And there was a crowd of people around and he fired a shot into the crowd of people, killing someone. People saw this happen, so they rushed Kyle Rittenhouse to take his gun. And while he was in the scuffle, he fired two shots, one shot killing another man and one shot injuring another man. So he's now on trial for murder. I was watching this and a couple of things stood out to me. I want to talk to you about language. I want to talk to you about perspective. But first, let me start off by telling you some of the things that stood out to me. Number one, at the time of this incident, he was 17 years old, too young to own the assault rifle that he owned. The rifle belonged to his mother, apparently. And it is illegal to cross state lines with a weapon such as this and then killing two people. So let's talk about language and let's talk about perspective. So there are people who perceive Kyle Rittenhouse as like the worst possible way you could perceive him. Then there are other people who literally view him as a hero. In fact, someone that I admired as a child, an actor named Ricky Schroeder. And growing up, Ricky Schroeder was one of the stars of a TV show called Silver Spoons. And as a child, I loved that show. And he was also in a movie that I quite enjoy called Crimson Tide. I've known of this actor for a really long time, who identifies as a conservative Republican. And when Kyle Rittenhouse was in jail awaiting charges, he had a bond. I believe it was for $2 million, but he had a large bond. And Ricky Schroeder contributed significantly to that bond to get him out of jail. And when he was asked why, he said, because I didn't think it was right for Kyle Rittenhouse to sit in jail having done nothing wrong. And I thought about that for a really long time. And I just thought, because for me, it seems really obvious that he's done wrong things. Carrying a weapon across state lines when that's against the law is one thing. But also killing two people when he claims self-defense. Number one, the car dealership in which he claimed to be defending was not his. So it's not self-defense even by property. And I looked it up this morning. The law, in order for it to be self-defense, you have to be in a situation where, in essence, it's either your life was in danger and the only way to protect your life was to take someone else's life, which wasn't true in this circumstance. It's one of those things where it's like our perspective guides the way we view things to such a degree that we can have completely different experiences just given the perspective that we take. And then the second thing is the power of language. One of the reasons why this story came in the news is because the judge has decided you cannot use the word victim in reference to the three people shot, two of them dead. You cannot use the word victim because it's too polarizing. But you can use the word rioter. You can use the word inciter. Like you can use other words to describe the three people that were shot, but you cannot use the word victim because it is too loaded against Kyle Rittenhouse. And I just think unbelievable. So one of them highlights the power of language. Like the word victim is so powerful and so against Kyle Rittenhouse that they remove it as a word that can be used. And the perspective that you take on these circumstances really guides how different the experiences are. Like I've said before, I think one of the problems with society is we don't value life enough. And two people are dead and they can't come back. They're gone, like for real gone. And if not for the actions of Kyle Rittenhouse, that wouldn't be true. Even if you disagree with the reasons these people were protesting,
You do have to understand they had a right to protest that's protected by the Constitution of the United States of America. And they weren't protesting violently. Like, they did not have weapons. They did not have guns. They weren't armed. They're gone. And I think we have to understand life in a different way. We have to cherish life in a different way. And thus, I think people should be held accountable when they take it. But for me, those are the things that stood out as I was thinking about that trial. So I'm curious what your thoughts are.
As I think about what you're saying, and I think about this idea of perspective and the value and importance of language, I think you're right. It kind of all culminates in this particular experience. One of the things that I would say is that it's really valuable for us to, in some sense, take one step back and look at this experience and this legal experience in the perspective of a grander narrative, since we're focusing on language, right? I think oftentimes we view the legal process as neutral or as unbiased. Oftentimes we are told or thought that we need to consider these legal proceedings as valueless, right? I don't mean that it's not important, but that our individual values don't get put onto this process. And I think that when we look at language and when we look at perspective, we have to acknowledge that that's actually not true. That an individual judge making determinations is going to be impacted by their own experience, their own perspective, the language that they grew up with. Each of the lawyers will bring their personal perspective to the situation, not to mention that they are charged with bringing a perspective, a one particular perspective, right? One is charged with bringing the perspective of prosecution. One is charged with bringing the perspective of defense. And so I think that in all of that process, we need to acknowledge that we're still all people, that the judge is a person, that the lawyers are people, that the jurors are people that have individual perspective, and that when a jury is selected, each of the sides, the prosecuting and the defense sides, are trying to get people on the jury that will support their perspective. Again, they're trying to build a case, and they want to put people on the jury who are receptive to the particular case they will build. And so the legal system is founded on the premise of perspective. It's founded on the premise of language. And then you take even a bigger step back and you consider the laws that our government institutes and puts into place. And they're from a particular narrative, right? You start with the Constitution that defines some people. And in this case, I would say the people we're not allowed to call victims, defines them as 3/5 of a person, right? And if that's the foundation that then all other laws are built from, then when we get to the current day, we can't say that this experience is happening devoid of that perspective. You think about the fact that slavery wasn't abolished until the 13th Amendment, and even then it wasn't totally abolished. You think about women and people of color, they weren't even allowed to influence the legal process because they weren't allowed to vote, right? Until much, much later. So we have a history of oppression that the legal system gets built on, that gets played out in this particular instance. And you can see some of those perspectives, those hanging on perspectives, come to play in what gets determined as admissible and not admissible, right? That you can't call someone a victim, but you can call them a rioter. That's laced with personal perspective. That's laced with legal perspective, but it also carries a gravity in the language simply because the words we choose color how we view those people who were murdered. If we don't acknowledge them as victims, then it's no longer a murder. If we label them as rioters, if we label them as inciters, that then changes the perspective that they were the aggressors in the situation, which again it really colors that this is not an unbiased process, that in the language we use, bias gets introduced.
As a person of color, the biggest fear we have is that that bias will be effective. So, like, in essence, Adam, as you just said, if we have a circumstance where we're no longer using words like victim, then that means there was no murder. And if there was no murder, that means there was no murderer. And thus, no one gets held accountable. And that's our biggest fear, is that, well, I'll say two things. That's our biggest fear, is that this murder happened and the perpetrator will not be held accountable. And it makes us feel like our lives are not as valuable. Now, I'll be honest, I actually don't know the racial makeup of the three victims. I'm going to use the word victim because I'm not in the court. So I don't know the racial makeup of the three victims. I did see one image and that person looked white to me, but I don't know the actual racial makeup of the three victims. But the reason why I'm comfortable saying that it's like a message that our lives don't matter is because they were protesting the death of a Black man. So these three people who got shot represent defending a Black man. And if someone killed them while they were doing that, it feels a lot like our lives don't matter as much. And that's scary to me. That's scary to people of color, that my life doesn't matter to such a degree that even someone who is not a person of color, who is standing with people of color, is subjected to the same victimization or the same cruelty or the same oppression as I would be. And that's a terrifying thing for me. Like, those lives needed to account for something, and someone took them. Like, someone took those lives. And the other thing I will say is, if we turned the corner, like, Adam, can you imagine if we lived in a world where there was like a Charlottesville type protest, Unite the Right type protest, and a Black man was walking down the street carrying an assault rifle and killed three Unite the Right protesters? There is no possible way there would be people defending that person. There is no possible way that politicians would be holding that person high as a hero. And that just feels terrible. That just feels bad.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, I guess I should go back and clarify. I don't think that the victims were people of color. So I didn't mean to insinuate that that was the case. But you articulated it really well, which is that they were standing for a purpose to defend people of color, right? And I think whether or not they were people of color, by not allowing them to be called victims, you eliminate what they stood for. You downgrade what they stood for, which is equality. And I think anytime equality takes a hit, we are lesser for it. I do think one of the things that is really, really important and valuable is, again, the narrative that gets created. Even a debate, right? Was Kyle standing for protection? Was that his role, right? I think whenever we militarize civilians and we give them power to hold other people down, that's a problem. Whenever we venerate that person as a hero, that's a problem. Whenever we question motives, when clearly he, like you mentioned, he crossed state lines, he brought an assault weapon. Whenever we give one person allowances that are illegal, we simultaneously blacken the legal system as a whole. We automatically downgrade the value of our own legal system. I think you're right. I think one of the major concerns here is that people of color, once again, are devalued, are dehumanized. But I think that an additional risk is that our legal system gets denigrated, that what we consider justice gets denigrated, that it undermines trust. And I think that that shows a huge reason why we focus on language, why we focus on perspective, because it isn't just that they're using the wrong word. but it's that they're undermining the system with which they are appointed to uphold. And I think that's a huge problem.
How do we fix it?
I think part of how we fix it is we do this, right? We talk about it. We say, this is inaccurate. This is unjust for a system that's supposed to be about justice. We make ourselves aware and we make others aware so that hopefully it gets better going forward.
So I have a different idea on how we fix it. I think about this a lot, and in situations like this, like I think about times when justice was not served. And you and I experienced this earlier this year, actually, when we went to Glendora, Mississippi. And those of you listening who don't know, Glendora, Mississippi is the place where Emmett Till was likely murdered. And it was where he was discovered. That's where he was pulled out of the river. In theory, he was murdered somewhere. People heard screaming in a barn in Glendora. So that's where we think it happened. They discovered his body in a river in Glendora, Mississippi. And no justice was ever done in that case. 2 men were put on trial. Those men were acquitted by an all-white jury of Mississippians. They later did an interview for a magazine and admitted to doing it, but because of double jeopardy laws in this country, they couldn't be tried again. The woman who started this whole thing, the woman that Emmett Till whistled at, and she was, by witness account, at the scene when he was abducted. The woman continues to live in Mississippi and has lived her life, and there's no accountability. Adam, we went to Glendora, Mississippi, and interviewed people who live in that area and could see they are still frustrated. We could see they are still traumatized. We could see they were still impacted by the fact that there's been no accountability. The lack of accountability leads to frustration, and sometimes that frustration overflows and turns into riots and violent acts and looting and all of the crazy things that happen that I'm not justifying. But I think it was Martin Luther King who said riots are the language of the unheard. And I'm scared that like this Kyle Rittenhouse case is going to go in a way that leads to more racial frustration. But how do we solve it? I think we solve it by prioritizing compassion amongst elected officials. And I think what we have to do is talk about compassion as openly as we talk about mathematics. You know what I mean? Like we have to teach compassion to our children. We have to talk about care. It's very important that compassion become a trait that we value in the same way that we value athletics, in the same way that we value good looks, or the same way that we value a nice car. Compassion has got to become a trait that we value. And I think when you look at it through that perspective, then you see 2 murdered, 1 injured, their lives mattered. And we need to have compassion for that. We need to have compassion for the frustration that brought them to that place in the first place. And if someone were to ask me, like, Elliott, what do you think America needs? Or what do you think society needs? What do you think the world needs? I would say more compassion. I mean, I know people are sick of hearing about it, but like this COVID circumstance has led me to believe very strongly that we don't value compassion enough. Because Adam, if I don't enjoy wearing a mask, I'll be the first one to tell you, it is irritating to me. I have a significant kind of allergy issue. And when I wear something on my nose, it like tickles my nose and triggers sneezing and running. It is uncomfortable and I don't like it. But I do it because it makes society safer. And Adam, if you told me, hey, Elliott, we want to invite you to our house, but our youngest daughter, Juju, is allergic to blue. So you can't wear any blue because if she sees blue, she goes blind for an hour. So you can't wear any blue. I would totally be like, you know what, blue is my favorite color, but I'll just pack other colors. Like, it wouldn't dawn on me to be like, I have the right to wear what I want and your daughter just has to deal. Like, that would never cross my mind. And I think the solution to all of this is an increase in the way we value compassion.
I think that's really valuable because I think compassion, when you think about what compassion is, it's about seeing something from someone else's perspective. It doesn't mean that you have to agree. It doesn't mean that you have to embrace wholly what they see or what they believe or what they do, but it does imply that you see what they see. You see it through their eyes, and that you express, again, it's not that you have to express agreement, but it's that you express that it's okay that they see it that way. We've talked about this in regards to solution-focused therapy, that really it's what trips up some solution-focused therapists is that they think that the way that the person is living their life is wrong, right? That they're living life wrong. And really what makes solution focus powerful when done correctly is that we value whatever the client values. And we say it's okay for you to think that way, to feel that way, to behave that way. Your perspective is a valuable perspective. And I think you're right. I think compassion is the remedy for ignorance, for bias, for whatever, because we begin to see what other people see and we value it simply because that's someone's opinion.
Right. And I think that's the call to action, is to ask people to behave with compassion, to respond from a position of compassion, to increase the value of compassion. And we all do it. How many times have you gone to someone's house and they say, would you take off your shoes? You don't say, nope, I chose to put on my shoes. I have the right to wear shoes. I'm wearing shoes. You just take off your shoes because you value this person has made a request that will improve their life. Whether or not it makes it, like, it may decrease my life satisfaction, but it will improve their life. So I'm going to take off my shoes. Let's understand that we all have compassion within us. We just need to access it and utilize it more frequently and more freely. And that's how real change happens. So all of you listening, just behave with a bit more compassion. And I think the world immediately and instantly becomes a better place.
This podcast was brought to you by the Solution Focused Universe, which is the largest online training community dedicated to the solution-focused approach and the growth of professionals interested in mastering the solution-focused approach. And brought to you by Solution Focused Notes, which is the only online electronic health record system dedicated to solution-focused professionals, where they can find templates to use treatment plans, progress notes, intake forms, everything you need to run a practice electronically, calendar, your charting system, and all of it tailored to the needs of solution-focused professionals.